series of videos showing the top side, the underhood, the interior, and then I wanted to show the underside and so forth, and finalize it in spring as it's put away for winter, a ride and drive. So stay tuned for more and enjoy this. Thank you. This is a Shelby Super Snake Sport, 2021 model year, and I bought this earlier this year in June, put approximately 5,200 miles on it. As we speak today, it's early December 22, and I put it away for winter. The truck is based on an F150 regular cab, 6.5 foot box, 122-inch wheelbase, a regular Ford blue, and the tonneau cover is painted to match, and stripes were added to this vehicle, of which I have decided to eliminate the ones that ran across the back of the tailgate. I kept them on the top of the tonneau cover, the roof of the truck, and also the hood of the truck, ending just in front of these little air intakes on the top of the hood. And so it was just rather busy looking, I thought, in the front with the striping going all the way down. So carefully remove those, and I'm not disappointed. As any F-150, current F-150 is, it's an entirely aluminum cab, doors, fenders, bed. But interestingly enough, the hood is steel. This is an aftermarket hood, and it has, this is functional in terms of inlet. The cold air inlet is right in this area here, and then there's these extractors on the top to create some velocity, pulling warm air out. And so Shelby had the intentions of building 350. I am not sure that they met that goal because of supply limitations. This truck was a late delivery in 22, like I said, June, and I believe the number on the truck is number 141. So not sure if they met the goal, because I believe they're making 22s, and kind of typical of Shelby American, they're always a year behind. You know, Ford builds these trucks, they take delivery, and then they have to modify and make their modifications and so on. The exterior is pretty much a standard F-150, and I'll go through some of the details that do differ. These wheel lips, which come out about approximately 3/4 of an inch, are add-ons. They put their own vent extractor on there with their own script, and they added on this back here, they actually had a design that was a Super Snake Sport. Not bad looking. I just didn't think it really meant anything, especially when there's a Shelby graphic on the side here. There's a Super Snake Sport emblem there, a 4x4 decal. So to me, that's a little more street cred, that the fact that this just isn't a two-wheel drive, it's a 4x4. The lighting is stock XLT, and which means the headlights are really sort of disappointing, and I end up going with these LEDs to replace the low beam, high beam, and the fog lights with an LED, the more high intensity, and so hopefully that will make for a safer driving at night. I just feel that once you have had HID headlights and then you go back to these halogen style, it's just not adequate, really. Overall, I'm pleased with the truck. When I first took delivery of it, I was replacing an X5 M50, which was a very refined, nice driving vehicle, and we still have that in our family. And so this was a bit rough and ready, as anybody can attest to driving a full-frame truck. They're not exactly sporty in terms of how they drive, and as far as refinement, you do get some body quivering and so forth. But once I started trailering, the trailer here which is approximately, I was at about 6,400 total additional weight with passengers, trailer, vehicle and trailer and so on. The truck really kind of came onto its own and really made me appreciate that I made a wise decision. You know, the classic American truck. I had a '04 Lightning for approximately 7 years, and I just kind of felt that I was fit who I kind of perceive myself to be. But anyway, let's take a look more in the interior and go from there. So now we're in the interior of the F150 Super Snake Sport. And anybody who has an F150 or otherwise is familiar with an F150 XLT, you'll feel just at home here. This is very much an XLT in terms of the screen size, control layout, steering wheel controls, and door panels, carpeting, and essentially the colors. The deviations that Shelby made in terms of modifications would be the seat covering, which has a custom logo on the backside, this sort of plastic faux carbon fiber trim that surrounds the dashboard, and steering wheel controls. And the gauges are definitely different, so we have unique graphics on the speedometer and the tachometer. And if you look at the tach, it has the Shelby written out in sort of a block lettering, and then Carroll Shelby's signature on the speedometer. Kind of unique. Also, the pedals have simply these aluminum appliques on top. And other than that, I don't know that there's really anything that I can add other than the numbered dash plaque. So this is truck 141, model year 2021. And it's not a bad place to be. It's relatively quiet. The seats are definitely comfortable. I think they are good. Not a lot of different adjustments, but I think it's a good driving position, and long-term seat comfort is good. I did a 1,200 mile drive in this, towing the trailer, and really no complaints in terms of my backside. And I can't always say that about every vehicle I've ever driven or owned. So in all, I think they did a good job based on the simplicity of the XLT. If you were to look at a Shelby Super Snake four-door, that would be based on the Lariat. So there you will have a little more finer. Well, you'll have a center console for one thing, and you'll have a bigger screen, and I believe there's a few other amenities. I rather like the 3-seat position. This reminds me a lot of my Lightning, that you have the adaptability of having a relatively compact truck and still have the ability to haul 3 people. I no longer have kids that run around with dad, taking them here and there. So this works out fine for me and my wife, and I guess an occasional third person, or if we still had a dog, it'd be nice for that as well. So all in all, quite pleased with the interior. Yeah, I think they did a pretty good job. As we move under hood, you can see the unique steel hood that is employed on this model, which is kind of interesting. Not a complaint. It seems to close well. It doesn't move around at speed. So happy with the overall execution in terms of heat extraction and intake coinciding with this cold air intake. Otherwise, really the only difference in here versus a standard issue 400 horsepower, well, what I would consider a Gen 4 Coyote truck engine, is the adaptation of a 3-liter Whipple supercharger. And this is essentially a stock tune Whipple engine management modifications. And the only thing that I added in terms of, well, thinking of long-term reliability, is I added a oil separator. It's the first thing I added before I even drove the truck. And over the course of, well, the 1,200 mile trip, and that was essentially with 2,000 miles on the oil, I had about 1 ounce of oil in there, and didn't show anything on the dipstick as far as oil usage. I did change the oil initially at 1,500 miles with a 550 that Shelby recommends, full synthetic. I used the Amsoil Signature Series 550, and then I changed it again at 3,000, again with Signature Series 550, and now I'll go 1 year because I believe I won't do more than 6,000 miles in a given year, and that should be more than adequate. So in terms of these engines versus the Mustang, it's kind of interesting. There isn't a lot of information out there, but I will say this: it has a different firing order than your standard Gen 3 Coyote, which is the same as a flathead V8. This uses a firing order that is the same as a 351 Windsor or a 5-liter HO. So essentially, you know, Ford speak, this is cylinder number 1. So instead of 1.5 crossing over on your firing order, it's 1.3. And I believe that back in the day when Ford did that with the 351 versus the 289 or standard 302, was that there was less of a stress on the front main bearing, and so the after the first hit, it goes back to 3. So it's kind of interesting that it's spread out along the crank versus hammering that first main bearing. And I think in truck applications that might be a durability sort of consideration. It also displaces 307 cubic inches, which is interesting, and it's essentially a square piston or cylinder design. It's 3.66 bore and a 3.65 stroke. So very typical of contemporary engines, where it seemed like back in the day engines were usually a little understressed in terms of having a over square, so they would have a larger bore than stroke. Well, in this case, this engine being designed back in 1991, and when cars were still in sort of a downsizing phase, and so Ford went with a very tight cylinder spacing, and so it is a very short engine, and the way that they do all the accessories, it makes for a relatively short engine, but because of the architecture being overhead cam or twin overhead cam, it's obviously a wider engine. And people will say, well, geez, it's such a big engine. I'm like, well, if it fits and if it works, who cares how big it is, as long as it works. I mean, putting headers on any car is not a treat. And we'll look at those a little bit when we take a look at the underside. Here's a body tag that shows the CSM number. The VIN number is registered with the Ford issued VIN number, which of course is located base of the windshield, but this is the official Shelby number, and the conversion is done in Elkhart, Indiana, which makes sense if you think about Elkhart, Indiana as sort of the trailer conversion, RV trailer capital of the United States. And the truck itself was made in Kansas City, Missouri. The front suspension is, for the most part, standard F150. It uses a OEM control arm, spindle, tie rod, rack and pinion, and sway bar. Sway bar is 1.1 inch. Modifications done by Shelby American are adding these Ride Tech upper control arms and Ride Tech coilover shocks. And I believe that they use this control arm because it has a different offset, because the front suspension has been lowered by 3 inches. And so in order to maintain proper geometry, they have a different control arm up top. The rear suspension was modified, I would say, significantly more than the front. The springs are standard regular cab F150 springs with this long steel spring and this lower weight spring, which is a composite. It looks like it's sort of a fiberglass resin-based deal. In order to get the 5 inches of lowered that they were going for, they, well, let's start here. They flipped the axle. So now the axle is riding on top of the spring. And they added a shackle that brings it up on the back. And although it's that is kind of offset by this other shackle that brings it down in order to fit the traction bars. So these traction bars have a heim joint front and back. And when the axle twists, you can just see right in here, there's a rubber stopper. So when the axle wants to when it turns, it wants to rotate up. And so this stopper then basically stops it from doing that. I've not really done a stop or a hard start from a dig with this, either in 2-wheel drive or 4-wheel drive. I've only really done roll-on stuff as I'm just being delicate with the truck. I kind of want to keep it. And the fact that it's a stock motor with a supercharger, I'm like, well, I don't want a headache later on. So I basically kind of just easing into it. But when I do give it full throttle, the back end seems to hook up. It's pretty interesting. This thing, the front end just rises up, the back end kind of squats, and it's almost terrifying. It's just, being such a relatively crude vehicle and you got that kind of power, it seems to, it tracks straight and true. It's just kind of odd, to see something or to be in something this big that gets up and goes like that. Otherwise, they did change the shocks. So they have the shock similar to the front, and they added a rear sway bar. So this is a frame-mounted sway bar that attaches to the axle, and that is also 1 1/8 like the front. It does make noise in the back when you're tooling around. It might be these high joints, but when I'm towing a trailer and I've got tongue weight on it and the springs are compressed, it's quieter. And so I just believe that there's a lot of unsprung mass. As you can tell, this is not an independent rear suspension. There's a big axle, and this is a heavy duty, 10.75 inch, and no lightweight deal. It's essentially cast iron housing, and we have a cast iron mounting bracket here for your rear brake caliper. The brakes are standard issue, single piston. They're 54 millimeter, and it's a floating piston or floating caliper. It's a design that, my God, I've seen these on Fords going back to the 80s, I think. The only difference here is that it has an electric parking brake. And then they added these covers to kind of look like the fronts. The front brakes measure 15 inches in diameter, the rotor. And these are a 6-piston Bear brake. And they're good. I felt like when I was towing, there's a couple situations where I had to get on the binders pretty hard, and I think they did a great job. Under normal driving, the vehicle tends to feel like it has more go than whoa. So it's not exactly a GT500 in terms of, or a GT350 having a lot of brake, and it doesn't seem to dive very much in the front, so I feel like the geometry is pretty decent in terms of, when you get on the brakes, it doesn't just, nose dive like certain cars in the past, like Fox bodies. And I think the brakes are there. Under normal use, they don't feel great. So anyway, I think but again, when I was towing a 6,000-pound trailer that does have trailer brakes, and having to slow down really quickly, didn't have any issues, so it seemed to work pretty good. A couple other things of note here, or maybe one of note, is this offset bar that Ford had added. I believe when they redesigned this truck back in 2015 and went with the aluminum body, they crash tested it, and subsequently the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or I think it was the II, the Insurance Institute for Rating Crash Standards, they were doing more offset testing. So this is an offset bar, and there's also an extension of the, can't quite, well, maybe you can see it, where the body mount mounts, and you can kind of see that bar goes past. So there's a sort of an offset bridge as well. And that's so when it gets hit on the side, the tire isn't, essentially crumbling the A-pillar area into the cab. So just to keep that cab more isolated from offset frontal collisions.